Hey there, welcome to the channel, where relaxation meets horror and fear of the unknown. Whether you're here for a peaceful night's rest or a heart-pounding scare, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on notifications. Every Tuesday, I'll be posting black screen videos with soothing rain sounds to help you relax, unwind, and drift off to sleep. But come Friday, Fright Day, I'll be sharing spine-chilling scary stories with eerie visuals to really bring the experience to life. I truly appreciate the support and love from my Fright family, especially everyone backing the channel on Patreon. A special shout out to Cryptid Sleeps for suggesting this video. Good night. My father and I had a unique routine when I was a kid. Late-night walks through our neighborhood. They started when I was young and continued for years, all because of his insomnia, a side effect of his long shifts at the factory. Our neighborhood was mostly safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where streetlights dotted the roads and dogs barked from fenced yards. Most of it was your typical suburban scene, except for one stretch of road that always felt different. This particular road lay at the very edge of the neighborhood, curving around a dense forest that stretched back for miles. There were no houses there, no traffic, just a single overgrown plot of land with a rusted gate and wild vegetation creeping over it. It stood out because, even though it was deserted, one flickering streetlight still illuminated a small patch of it. We walked this path often, despite its eerie vibe. My dad said he liked the silence of the woods, and I just liked being with him, even though the place always made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, everything changed. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the moon hung low, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. My dad and I set out as usual, walking down the familiar streets, our breaths fogging the cool air. We turned onto the forest road, the darkness closing in as the distance between streetlights grew wider. The wind rustled the leaves, and aside from the occasional owl hooting, it was quiet. Just the two of us in the stillness of the night. As we neared the overgrown plot, my dad suddenly stopped mid-stride. His body went rigid, his grip on my hand tightening so much it hurt. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but before I could utter a word, he put a hand over my mouth, crouching down and pulling me with him into the shadows. His reaction was so sudden and out of character that fear gripped me instantly. My dad had always been the calm, rational one, the person who shrugged off anything remotely frightening. But now, his eyes were wide, darting between the trees, his breathing quick and shallow. "Stay quiet," he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I followed his gaze, trying to figure out what had spooked him. At first, I saw nothing. Just the same eerie, flickering streetlight casting its pale glow over the tangled weeds and brush of the abandoned lot. But then, something moved. My heart skipped a beat. From the shadows near the edge of the illuminated area, a figure stepped out, barely visible in the dim light. It was small, no taller than 3 feet, and unnaturally thin, its limbs long and awkward. At first, I thought it might be a child, lost and wandering. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its movements were jerky, almost animalistic, and its skin, it didn't look right. It was pale, almost gray, and seemed to shimmer under the flickering light. I felt a scream building in my throat, but my father's hand tightened over my mouth. His eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel his entire body trembling beside me. As I stared, frozen in terror, The small figure slowly scanned its surroundings, its head moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. Then it raised a long, bony arm and made a gesture, a signal. My blood ran cold as from the darkness behind it, two more figures emerged, identical to the first. They were cautious, stepping lightly, their eyes, if they had eyes, locked on the forest just beyond the light. The three creatures stood huddled together for a moment, whispering to each other in soft, guttural sounds that I couldn't make sense of. I strained to hear, but the language, if it was a language, wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was chilling, like the wind howling through a crack in a door, unnatural. Suddenly, one of them turned its head in our direction. For a brief second, I felt like it was looking right at us, though I couldn't see any discernible features on its face. Just a vague, dark void where eyes should have been. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could barely breathe. Did it see us? Could it sense we were there? I clutched my father's arm tightly, and I could feel his pulse racing just as fast as mine. Without warning, the creatures turned and sprinted, darting toward the forest with alarming speed, their thin bodies disappearing into the dense trees. The sound of their footsteps, barely audible but distinctly there, faded quickly into the night. For a moment, my father didn't move. He stayed crouched, still holding me close, his breath shallow and panicked. I felt like time had stopped, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. But then, in an instant, he was up. Without a word, he hoisted me up over his shoulder, something he hadn't done since I was a little kid. Despite being 6 feet 5 inches and 220 pounds, he moved with the urgency of a man running for his life, carrying me effortlessly as he sprinted down the road. The half-mile back to our house felt like it lasted an eternity. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier, as if the entire forest was watching us flee. I buried my face in his shoulder, trying not to look, trying not to think about what I'd seen. I could feel his heart racing beneath my cheek, and it only made my fear worse. When we finally reached the safety of our home, my father slammed the door behind us, locking it immediately. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he went straight to the garage and started rummaging around, pulling out tools and boxes. Over the next few days, he installed floodlights around the entire perimeter of our property, motion activated, bright enough to turn night into day. He brought home a dog, a big, protective breed he had never wanted before. It was as if he was preparing for something, as if those figures might come back. I tried asking him about that night, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he refused to talk about it. The few times I brought it up, he shut down, his face growing dark with a look I had never seen before, a look of raw fear. "We're not discussing it," he'd say firmly, ending the conversation every time. And after a while, I stopped asking. It's been 15 years since that night, and I still remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The sight of those small, humanoid figures, their strange, jerky movements, the way they huddled together before vanishing into the woods, it all haunts me. I can still feel the cold grip of fear that seized me when one of them seemed to look right at us, and I still wonder what might have happened if we hadn't stayed hidden, if we hadn't run. To this day, my father has never gone back to that road, and neither have I. Whatever we saw that night, it was enough to end our walks forever. And though the forest remains quiet, I can't shake the feeling that something out there saw us too. When I was 9 years old, my family and I were staying with my aunt for a couple of nights. It was supposed to be a fun visit filled with laughter and memories, but instead it turned into something I would never forget. During those 2 nights, I experienced something unsettling and inexplicable, something that tormented me in ways I couldn't understand. From the moment I laid down to sleep, I felt a strange presence in the room. It began subtly, just a flicker in my peripheral vision. Whenever I glanced over, there was nothing there, but I could sense it lurking just out of sight. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, a trick of the mind that often plays games on children in unfamiliar places. But as darkness enveloped the house and the sounds of the night filled the air, I soon realized that it was far more than just a figment of my imagination. On the first night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sensation crawling over my body. At first, it was just a light tickle, like a gentle brush against my skin, but then it escalated. I felt something scratch me, the sharpness piercing through the calm of the night. I bolted upright, heart racing, and looked around, desperately searching for the source of this unwelcome disturbance. But every time I tried to grab at it or focus my gaze, it seemed to shift, darting to another part of my body, evading my attempts to confront it. Feeling helpless, I decided to call out for my aunt, dad, or uncle, hoping that their presence would somehow make it stop. I thought that if I had someone else with me, the unsettling sensation would fade away. But when I went to them, they were sound asleep, oblivious to my plight. I felt isolated, trapped in my own fear, as the scratching continued relentlessly. It was as if this unseen entity was toying with me, enjoying the chaos it created. The hours dragged on, and I was exhausted, both from the fear and the lack of sleep. Each time I thought I could finally relax, it would return, crawling over me, its small but formidable presence relentless. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until morning, but every time I looked away, it seemed to get closer. It never left a mark on my skin, but the scratches felt real enough, leaving me with a lingering pain that was both physical and emotional. By the time the second night rolled around, I was filled with dread. I could hardly bear the thought of going through it all again, yet there was no escape. I stayed alert, knowing that the darkness would soon return. And true to form, it did. The same eerie sensations returned, but this time it felt different, more aggressive, more confident. It crawled across my body with an unnerving speed, like a predator that had learned my weaknesses. The creature's appearance was just as disturbing as its behavior. From the corner of my eye, I caught fleeting glimpses of it. It was roughly the size of an average adult woman's hand, and had a light tan, almost yellowish hue. Its skin looked raw and smooth, devoid of any features one might expect from a living being. There were no eyes or mouth, just a front that seemed to watch me. Its 5 or 6 limbs had knuckle-like joints, and the shape wasn't symmetrical, almost grotesque in its design. After those 2 harrowing nights, the entity seemed to vanish as mysteriously as it had come. I never experienced anything like it again. And though my dad remembers those 2 nights, he never saw anything out of the ordinary. It was a relief, but also unsettling. What was that creature? Why did it choose me? Was it something from my imagination, or was it a genuine entity that had slipped into our world? Years have passed, and I've often found myself thinking back to those nights. I've searched online forums, and tried to find any mention of such a creature, but I've found nothing that fits the description. The memories are still vivid in my mind, each detail ingrained deeply. I wonder if anyone else has experienced something similar. If there's anyone out there who might have insight into what I encountered, I would love to hear your thoughts. The mystery of those nights still lingers, a haunting memory that occasionally resurfaces, reminding me of the things we can't explain. It was a cool, crisp evening in the fall of 1994. The sun had just set, leaving a deep orange glow along the horizon. The sky was slowly getting darker, and the chilly air felt like winter was just around the corner. I was driving alone on a quiet country road in Pennsylvania, far from the city and surrounded by farmland and forests. It was the kind of road where you could go miles without seeing another car. The road stretched out in front of me, winding through the empty fields. The trees on either side rustled as the wind passed through their branches, and the leaves, now red and gold, were scattered across the road. The radio was barely on, just playing softly in the background. It was so peaceful that I almost forgot how alone I was out there. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the growing darkness. There were no streetlights, no houses, just the endless road ahead. I remember feeling calm, but also a little uneasy. There's something strange about being in a place so quiet and empty. It's like the world is holding its breath. I was lost in thought when something up ahead made me slow down. Sitting on an old wooden fence on the side of the road was a massive bird. I blinked, trying to make sure I was seeing it right. At first, I thought it must be something else. Maybe a large animal, like a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it really was a bird. But not just any bird. This bird was enormous. It was so big that its body looked like it was the size of a small deer or a goat. It sat there, completely still, perched on top of the fence, like it was waiting for something. Its feathers were dark, black as night, and they seemed to blend into the shadows. The bird's head was turned slightly, and it looked like it was staring right at me as I approached. I slowed my car down to a crawl, my heart starting to race. I had never seen anything like it before. What kind of bird could be this big? It didn't make any sense. I thought about stopping the car altogether, but something about the way it just sat there made me feel uneasy. The road was narrow, with no room to go around, so I had no choice but to keep moving forward. As I got closer, my headlights lit up the creature, making it even more terrifying. The bird's body was massive, and the way it sat so calmly on the fence gave me chills. It didn't move, it didn't flinch. It was as if it didn't care about my car or me. For a moment, I thought it might just sit there and let me pass. But then, just as I came level with it, the bird moved. It stretched out its wings slowly, almost lazily, and what I saw next nearly made me stop the car completely. Its wings were enormous. They unfolded like dark curtains being drawn across the sky. Each wing had to be at least 10 feet long, maybe more, making the total wingspan at least 20 feet. The wings were so wide that they blocked out the sky above, covering my car in shadow. The sound of its wings was deep and heavy, like the beating of a drum, and the air around me seemed to thicken. For a moment, everything went dark, and all I could see was the shadow of the bird as it passed over my car. I ducked my head, even though I knew I was safe inside, because the feeling of something so big flying right over me was overwhelming. It felt like the world had shrunk, and I was trapped under this massive creature's wings. The bird rose up into the sky with little effort, flying smoothly and silently above the trees. I craned my neck to watch it, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had never felt so small in my life. the bird disappeared into the night sky, blending with the darkness until I could no longer see it. But even after it was gone, the feeling of unease stayed with me. The road seemed even quieter now, and the shadows felt deeper, like the bird's presence had changed something about the night. When I finally reached my destination, a small house where my friends were waiting, I was still in shock. The moment I stepped inside, I couldn't hold back the story. I told them everything: the bird, its size, the way it had blocked out the sky as it flew over my car. My voice was shaking as I described how huge it was, and I could see my friends exchanging looks, unsure whether to believe me. They tried to laugh it off. One of them said it was probably just a big crow or a turkey vulture. Another said I must have been tired and imagined it being bigger than it was. They all tried to come up with explanations, but I knew none of them were right. This bird was far too large for any normal species. I could still picture the way it had perched on that fence, so calm and still, like it didn't belong in this world. I should have taken them back to the spot. I should have shown them the fence and how high the bird had been sitting. I could have measured the post and proven that no ordinary bird could sit there the way it did. But at the time, I was too shaken to think clearly, and I just let them laugh it off. Even now, all these years later, I can still remember every detail of that night. The quiet road, the fence, and that enormous black bird. It's a memory that never fades. Sometimes I wonder what it was and where it came from. But one thing I know for sure: what I saw wasn't normal, and it wasn't something I'll ever forget. It was a warm summer evening, and I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying the gentle breeze as the sun began to set. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, creating a perfect backdrop for an evening of laughter and deep conversation. My best friend and I were lost in a lively discussion, talking about everything from our favorite movies to the latest happenings in our lives. The atmosphere felt cozy and safe, as if the world outside our little bubble was far away. As we chatted, we suddenly heard an odd sound coming from inside my house, something that resembled footsteps or the sound of someone running through the hallway. The noise was startling, cutting through our laughter like a sharp knife. We paused, exchanging worried glances, our smiles fading into concerned expressions. "Did you hear that?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. My friend nodded, wide-eyed, and we both fell silent for a moment, trying to make sense of what we had just heard. I leaned closer to her, whispering, "What if the back door isn't locked?" The thought made my heart race. We were sitting right beside the front door, and there were no other exits to my house. It was unsettling to think that someone might have entered without us noticing. We debated back and forth, wondering if it could have been just the house settling or the floorboards creaking. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us in the dim light of dusk. "Let's go check," I suggested, though a part of me felt hesitant. Together, we made our way inside, our footsteps echoing through the stillness. The house felt empty, and as we searched each room, a sense of unease grew in the pit of my stomach. There was no one there. Everything was just as we had left it. With a sigh of relief, we returned to the porch, but the eerie feeling lingered in the air. We resumed our conversation, attempting to shake off the strange encounter. Just as we began to relax, something caught our attention out of the corner of our eyes. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, but when we turned to look, we were both frozen in place. A thick, black fog-like shadow hovered at the edge of the porch, just beneath the roof. It was unlike anything we had ever seen, an amorphous shape, almost like a large, distorted ball made entirely of darkness, absorbing all light around it. It was so dark that it seemed to pull the light in, creating an almost tangible wall of shadow that felt heavy and oppressive. For a few moments, we both stared in disbelief. The shadow lingered, swirling slightly as if it were alive. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, yet I was also captivated by the strange sight. It hovered there, blocking our view of the roof, and I could feel my friend's tension beside me as we shared a silent understanding that this was not just a trick of the light. We were both witnessing something extraordinary, something that felt utterly wrong in the comforting space of my porch. "What is that?" my friend whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I shook my head, unable to form words as I remained entranced by the shadow. It was as if time had stopped, and for a few heart-stopping moments we were completely absorbed in the strange phenomenon. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow began to dissipate, slowly fading away into the night like a wisp of smoke. Our hearts raced as we watched it vanish, leaving us in stunned silence. The porch returned to its normal state, the light breaking through once more as if nothing had ever happened. "Did you see that?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. "I can't believe it," my friend replied, her eyes wide with disbelief. We looked at each other, both wondering if we had simply imagined it, if fatigue had played tricks on our minds after a long day. But we both knew deep down that we had seen something unusual, something that felt too real to ignore. As the night wore on, we continued to talk about what had happened, but the shadow never returned. It remained a mystery that hung in the air between us, a strange encounter that we couldn't explain. Neither of us had experienced anything like it before, and in the following days we found ourselves thinking back to that evening, questioning whether it was a shared hallucination or a glimpse into something otherworldly. Whatever it was, it left an imprint on our memories, a reminder that sometimes the world holds mysteries we may never fully understand. One night, during a rare blood moon, I felt an irresistible urge to capture its beauty on camera. The sky was painted with vibrant hues, and I knew that a secluded spot just outside of town would provide the perfect backdrop. After gathering my gear, I drove out to the area I had in mind, a quiet place near a creek where I often saw people shore fishing. The ambiance felt tranquil, and I was excited to set up my equipment. As I parked my car, I noticed a young tree that had fallen by the creek, its branches scattered like a natural barrier. I began to unload my camera and tripod, eagerly setting up the scope to get the best angle of the moon. The sounds of nature surrounded me. The gentle rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the distant croak of frogs. But soon, I began to hear something unusual. At first, it was just light rustling in the brush, something that felt familiar enough to ignore, especially since coyotes were common in the area. With my handgun securely holstered on my hip, I didn't think much of it. However, the rustling quickly escalated into something more alarming, resembling the sounds of something large crashing violently through the underbrush. My heart rate quickened as I stopped what I was doing and turned on my flashlight, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the disturbance. Perhaps it was a cow or a deer that had wandered off the beaten path. But when I shined my light around the area, I found nothing, just shadows and the eerie silence that followed. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I decided to start packing up my gear, convinced that it was time to leave. Just as I was about to put the last piece of equipment away, I heard splashing, followed by a loud crack. Something had just broken through the underbrush and my instincts kicked in. I turned, drawing my gun, and aimed my flashlight towards the source of the noise. That's when I saw it. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Standing before me was a creature that towered at about 6 feet, resembling a wolf but much larger than any wolf I had ever seen. Its features were wild, its fur a mix of dark colors that blended into the night around it. The moment the light hit its form, it paused, locking its intense gaze onto me. I felt a chill run down my spine as it growled, a deep, resonating sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. Before I could fully process what was happening, the creature charged at me. Panic surged through my veins as I fired 8 shots in rapid succession, each pull of the trigger filled with adrenaline and fear. I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of urgency as the creature barreled into me, knocking me flat onto the ground. In that instant, I thought the worst was about to happen, but instead of following through with its attack, the creature continued running, darting into a nearby cornfield and disappearing into the darkness. Stunned and heart racing, I quickly got up, leaving the rest of my gear behind in my haste to escape the area. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. The moon hung high above, casting an eerie light on the world around me as I drove away, a mixture of disbelief and terror swirling within me. The next day, my mind was still racing from the encounter. I felt compelled to return to the scene, needing to see it for myself in the daylight and gather my belongings. When I arrived, I was shocked to find a farmer, a couple of sheriffs, and a game warden already there. The farmer, whose sheep had been attacked the night before, had been driving around setting up trail cameras to monitor the area. He stumbled upon my equipment, the strange trail of flattened corn, and some peculiar prints in the mud. As I recounted my experience, I watched their faces, gauging their reactions. They listened intently, but I could sense skepticism in their responses. The game warden suggested it was probably a bear that had wandered too close to the field, but I shook my head in disbelief. The tracks we examined were distinctly not from a bear. They were too elongated and unusual in shape. Despite the explanations they offered, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something far more enigmatic that night. The sight of the creature's imposing form and the feral intensity in its eyes haunted me. I spent days replaying the event in my mind, questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world around me. To this day, I often think back to that night under the blood moon, and the mystery of what I saw lingers in the back of my mind. I wonder if anyone else has had a similar encounter, or if perhaps there's something in those woods that remains unknown to most. The experience has left me with more questions than answers, and a newfound respect for the things that lurk just beyond our perception. My father and I had a unique routine when I was a kid, late-night walks through our neighborhood. They started when I was young and continued for years, all because of his insomnia, a side effect of his long shifts at the factory. Our neighborhood was mostly safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where streetlights dotted the roads and dogs barked from fenced yards. Most of it was your typical suburban scene, except for one stretch of road that always felt different. This particular road lay at the very edge of the neighborhood, curving around a dense forest that stretched back for miles. There were no houses there, no traffic, just a single overgrown plot of land with a rusted gate and wild vegetation creeping over it. It stood out because, even though it was deserted, one flickering streetlight still illuminated a small patch of it. We walked this path often, despite its eerie vibe. My dad said he liked the silence of the woods, and I just liked being with him, even though the place always made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, everything changed. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the moon hung low, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. My dad and I set out as usual, walking down the familiar streets, our breaths fogging the cool air. We turned onto the forest road, the darkness closing in as the distance between streetlights grew wider. The wind rustled the leaves, and aside from the occasional owl hooting, it was quiet. Just the two of us in the stillness of the night. As we neared the overgrown plot, my dad suddenly stopped mid-stride. His body went rigid, his grip on my hand tightening so much it hurt. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but before I could utter a word, he put a hand over my mouth, crouching down and pulling me with him into the shadows. His reaction was so sudden and out of character that fear gripped me instantly. My dad had always been the calm, rational one, the person who shrugged off anything remotely frightening. But now, his eyes were wide, darting between the trees, his breathing quick and shallow. "Stay quiet," he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I followed his gaze, trying to figure out what had spooked him. At first, I saw nothing. Just the same eerie, flickering streetlight casting its pale glow over the tangled weeds and brush of the abandoned lot. But then, something moved. My heart skipped a beat. From the shadows near the edge of the illuminated area, a figure stepped out, barely visible in the dim light. It was small, no taller than 3 feet, and unnaturally thin, its limbs long and awkward. At first, I thought it might be a child, lost and wandering. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its movements were jerky, almost animalistic, and its skin, it didn't look right. It was pale, almost gray, and seemed to shimmer under the flickering light. I felt a scream building in my throat, but my father's hand tightened over my mouth. His eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel his entire body trembling beside me. As I stared, frozen in terror, the small figure slowly scanned its surroundings, its head moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. Then it raised a long, bony arm and made a gesture, a signal. My blood ran cold as from the darkness behind it, 2 more figures emerged, identical to the first. They were cautious, stepping lightly, their eyes, if they had eyes, locked on the forest just beyond the light. The 3 creatures stood huddled together for a moment, whispering to each other in soft, guttural sounds that I couldn't make sense of. I strained to hear, but the language, if it was a language, wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was chilling, like the wind howling through a crack in a door, unnatural. There's an old urban legend about seeing black dogs or so-called hellhounds, and if you encounter one 3 times, it's believed to be an omen of death. Though I've always been skeptical of such stories, there was one night that left me questioning whether I'd come face to face with something supernatural. It happened a few years ago, and even now, the memory sends a chill down my spine. I might have seen one of these legendary creatures, though I tried my best to convince myself otherwise. It was just a typical evening walk with our old family dog, a routine I'd done hundreds of times before. Our neighborhood is a strange mix of urban streets and wooded areas, with some parts well lit by streetlights and others swallowed up by pockets of darkness. As we walked, I suddenly felt an unsettling sensation, like someone or something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though no one else seemed to be around. As I continued walking, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. When I reached a hill, the streetlights became sparser, and the shadows stretched longer, giving the area an eerie vibe. My nerves were getting the best of me, so I decided to stop and look around, just to put my mind at ease. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the shadows, a large black dog stood completely still, watching me. It was massive, resembling a German shepherd, but it was almost as if its fur absorbed the light, making it look more like a shadow than a living creature. My heart raced, and I quickly bent down to pick up my dog, half expecting the black dog to come closer. But when I looked up again, it was gone. There hadn't been any sound, no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, nothing to indicate where it went or how it disappeared so quickly. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished without a trace. The silence that followed was so heavy, it was as if the entire street had been holding its breath. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a stray dog that had slipped away quietly, or maybe it had run off into the woods. But the odd part was that I hadn't heard anything. No claws against the pavement, no scurrying into the underbrush. It was just gone, as if it had never been there at all. That eerie feeling I'd had just moments before only deepened, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever I saw wasn't entirely of this world. Even now, I still think about that night. I've walked that same route dozens of times since then, but I've never seen that black dog again. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light, or a stray that vanished before I could make sense of it. But the way it made me feel, the way it seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly, left me with a lingering sense of unease. Whether it was just an ordinary dog or something more, I'll never truly know. But that shadowy figure still haunts the edges of my thoughts, leaving me to wonder if there's more truth to the old legends than I once believed. When I was around 10 or 11, I played in a little league baseball team that my dad coached. It was a big part of my childhood, and I have a lot of fond memories of those days. One of the fields we played on was tucked behind a school that sat right in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The field itself was pretty ordinary, but what made it stand out was the small patch of forest on one side, which always seemed a bit mysterious to me as a kid. I remember my teammates and I would often wander near the edge of the trees after our games, feeling drawn to its shadowy atmosphere, but we rarely ventured too far inside. One evening, after one of our games had wrapped up, I wandered over to the playground near the school while waiting for my dad to finish chatting with the other coaches. I remember the fading light of the day giving everything a soft orange glow. The air was cooling down, and the field was starting to empty as families headed home. I was absent-mindedly playing on the swings when something caught my eye. I glanced over toward the forest and saw a figure that immediately gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. It was a woman, or at least that's what she looked like from a distance. She was around 5 to 6 feet tall, wearing a thick black hoodie that seemed out of place for the time of year. She was walking quickly, almost running, toward the trees. But what really grabbed my attention was the way she was holding her hands over her face, as if she was either trying to hide something or shielding herself from something unseen. At first, I thought maybe she was upset or hurt, but then she turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. And that's when I saw her eyes. They were huge, unnaturally large, and bright yellow, like the eyes of a cat. The way they stood out, even from a distance, was startling. They were the kind of eyes that didn't just reflect the light. They seemed to glow on their own, almost giving her a surreal, otherworldly look. For a moment, I felt frozen, just staring in disbelief at what I was seeing. She disappeared into the trees without a sound, and I snapped out of my daze. I wanted to tell someone, but I wasn't sure what I had just witnessed. My young mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been my imagination playing tricks on me? Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I had seen her wrong. But the image of her, especially those unnerving eyes, felt so clear and real. It wasn't like other childhood memories that fade or blur with time. This one stuck with me, vivid and unsettling. After that day, I didn't talk about it much. At that age, it's easy to dismiss strange experiences as just a product of an overactive imagination, and that's exactly what I tried to do. I told myself I must have been tired after the game, or maybe I'd just seen a reflection off her glasses or something like that. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw was something more than just a random person. Over the years, that memory has lingered in the back of my mind. Sometimes I'll catch myself thinking about it when I'm alone, or when I see something that reminds me of that day. The strange part is that I can still remember her so clearly, the way she moved, the way her hands covered her face, and especially those piercing yellow eyes. They didn't look like they belonged to a person, and the more I think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Now, as an adult, I still don't have an explanation for what I saw. I've tried to reason it away, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But the memory hasn't faded. I've heard stories of strange encounters in forests, tales of people seeing things they can't explain, but I've never come across anything quite like what I experienced that evening behind the school. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or maybe there are things out there that we can't fully understand. Either way, that memory has stayed with me all these years, and I'm not sure it will ever truly go away. The night was thick with an unsettling silence as I ventured into the woods behind my childhood home. I had grown up hearing stories about the strange creatures that lurked in the shadows of those trees. Tales of cryptids that were said to roam the area, especially after dark. My friends often teased me about these legends, calling them silly folklore, but the stories had stuck with me. They were the kind of stories that sent a shiver down your spine, and I felt a mix of excitement and fear as I prepared to explore the woods on my own. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of adventure, I set out just after sunset, the last rays of daylight fading behind the tall pines. The trees loomed over me, casting eerie shadows that danced with every gust of wind. As I moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world outside faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced, and I reminded myself that I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. After wandering for what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the area in a silvery glow. I took a moment to catch my breath and enjoy the tranquility of the forest. But just as I began to relax, I heard a low growl echo through the trees. My heart dropped, and I froze in place, the hair on my arms standing on end. It was a sound I had never heard before, deep, guttural, and filled with an unmistakable menace. Instinctively, I shone my flashlight into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had made that noise. To my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at me from the edge of the clearing. They were impossibly large and seemed to hover just above the ground. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a tree root. The creature remained hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. As I tried to process what I was seeing, the creature stepped into the light. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It stood about 7 feet tall, with a gaunt, emaciated frame covered in matted, dark fur. Its limbs were elongated, and it moved with an unnatural grace that sent chills down my spine. The face was the most horrifying part. It had a snout similar to that of a wolf, but was twisted and elongated, with sharp yellow teeth glistening in the moonlight. I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. It felt like something straight out of a nightmare. I wanted to run, to escape back to the safety of my home, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those menacing eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It let out another low growl, more of a warning this time, and I finally found the strength to turn and flee. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced through the trees, branches scratching at my skin and the underbrush snagging at my feet. As I ran, I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footfalls echoing through the woods. It was gaining on me, and fear propelled me forward, pushing me past the limits of my endurance. I darted through the trees, my mind racing with thoughts of how I could escape. The darkness felt alive, and every shadow seemed to hide another pair of eyes watching me. I didn't dare look back. I could only focus on putting distance between myself and the terrifying creature that seemed intent on following me. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods and into the open field behind my house. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted straight for my front door, fumbling with the lock as panic surged through me. Finally, I managed to get inside and slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to calm my racing heart. The silence of my home felt deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. I could hardly believe what had just happened, my mind struggling to accept the reality of the encounter. For days afterward, I was haunted by the experience. I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. The way it moved, the chilling sound of its growl, and those glowing eyes that seemed to bore into my very soul. I found myself avoiding the woods even during the day, convinced that whatever I had seen was still lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Friends and family dismissed my story, laughing off the idea of cryptids and monsters, but I knew what I had experienced was real. The encounter changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I became more cautious and hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially when I was outside. The woods, which had once been a place of adventure, transformed into a realm of fear and uncertainty. I started researching local legends and other sightings of cryptids, hoping to find some answers or reassurance that I wasn't alone in my experience. It seemed I wasn't the first person to encounter something strange in those woods. Others had shared similar tales, each more chilling than the last. While I may never fully comprehend what I encountered that night, I know one thing for certain. Some mysteries are best left unexplored, and some creatures are best left undisturbed. The legend of the cryptid that stalked me through the woods will always be a part of my story, a reminder that the world is filled with unknowns, lurking just beyond our understanding. And every time I pass those woods, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, knowing that some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the dark. When I was in college, a group of friends and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in a remote area, known for its natural beauty and rumored supernatural happenings. Nestled deep in the heart of the woods, the campsite was surrounded by towering trees and serene silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of wildlife. Despite the picturesque setting, there was a lingering sense of unease that none of us could quite shake off, thanks in part to the local folklore surrounding the area. Stories of cryptids and strange creatures that were said to roam the forest after dark. After setting up our tents and gathering around the campfire, we began sharing ghost stories and legends we had heard over the years. One tale in particular caught my attention. It was about a creature known as the wendigo, a spirit said to haunt the woods, preying on those who ventured too far into its territory. According to the legend, the wendigo was a gaunt, skeletal figure with glowing eyes and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The more we talked, the more I could feel the chill in the air deepen, and I began to wonder if there was some truth to these stories. As night fell, we settled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire fading as the darkness enveloped us. I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone. The sounds of the forest seemed to change, growing more pronounced as the night wore on. The wind whispered through the branches, and I could hear the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. It was as if the forest was alive, watching us as we slept, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud commotion outside our tents. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound of rustling leaves and heavy footfalls echoed through the darkness, accompanied by frantic whispers from my friends. I unzipped the tent and peered outside, my flashlight cutting through the thick night air. The beam illuminated our campsite, but everything appeared normal. My friends were gathered around the fire, looking visibly shaken. "What happened?" I asked, stepping out into the cool night air. One of my friends, Sarah, looked pale as she explained that they had heard a strange growl coming from the direction of the woods. It was low and rumbling, unlike anything they had ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but not, she said, her voice trembling. The thought of a creature lurking in the shadows sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a mix of fear and curiosity urging me to investigate. As a group, we decided to venture toward the edge of the forest where the noise had originated. Armed with flashlights, we stepped cautiously into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick underbrush. Each snap of a twig beneath our feet felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of the night. We walked in silence, hearts pounding, straining to listen for any sign of the creature. The air was heavy with tension, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the trees. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the darkness again, closer this time. The sound sent us into a panic, and we turned to head back toward the safety of the campsite. But as we retreated, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure standing among the trees, its body slender and elongated. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, locking onto mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I froze, unable to look away as it tilted its head, studying us as if we were the prey. In that moment, the stories of the wendigo flooded my mind. The creature's gaunt form matched the descriptions I had heard, and the fear gripped me like a vice. I turned and ran, calling out to my friends as I sprinted back toward the campfire. We all scrambled back, hearts racing, breathless from fear and adrenaline. Once we reached the safety of the clearing, we huddled together, casting frantic glances into the dark forest behind us. We stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, sharing our thoughts on what we had seen. The air was electric with fear, and the campfire flickered ominously as we told each other our theories. Maybe it was just a bear, we told ourselves, or perhaps it was another camper playing a prank. But deep down, we all knew we had experienced something far more unsettling than any of us wanted to admit. As dawn broke and the first light of morning pierced through the trees, we packed our gear and left the campsite in haste. The shadows of the night still clung to our thoughts as we drove away, and I couldn't help but glance back at the woods one last time. The memory of those glowing eyes and the chilling growl haunted me, a constant reminder that some legends hold more truth than we are willing to acknowledge. Even now, whenever I find myself near a dense forest, I think back to that night and the creature we encountered. It's a tale that has become part of my personal lore, a reminder that there are things in the world that we cannot explain, lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding. The wendigo remains etched in my mind, a cryptid that serves as a warning to those who dare to venture too deep into the unknown.